Usually a line on a map is, well, it's absolute, right? It's binary. It's either yours or mine. You draw a sharp border across a mountain range, and you just, you know, assume that settles it.
Right, yeah. You assume the geometry dictates reality.
Exactly. But today we're doing a deep dive into the 1962 operations in the Western sector, specifically Ladakh, and what the source document shows is that placing a soldier on a map doesn't mean you control the mountain. It means you've given the enemy a target.
It's a pretty terrifying realization, because when you strip away all the politics, what you're left with is just a pure, unforgiving problem of physics. Geography and logistics.
Yeah, and before we really get into the weeds, we need to set some ground rules for you, the listener. Our mission today is to step into the boots of a military historian and campaign analyst. We're looking at a specific military document detailing one of the most challenging high-altitude conflicts in history.
Right, and just to be totally clear, we are maintaining strict impartiality here. The sources present a specific historical account of the Sino-Indian border dispute, and our goal is not to litigate the politics of the 1960 claim line or take sides.
Oh, for sure. We're just impartially reporting on the strategic and operational realities contained in the text. We aren't endorsing any specific territorial claims.
Exactly. We are asking one central question today, and this is the thesis that drives the entire analysis. Why does occupying territory require a complete operational system and not only forward presence?
I mean, that's the core of it all.
Yeah.
And to answer that, we aren't just going to give you a boring chronological timeline. We're going to dissect every major engagement using a very strict six-step analytical framework.
Yeah, that framework is strategic objective, leading to terrain challenge, then deployment decision, enemy response, battle outcome, and finally, lessons learned.
All right, so let's start with that first step, the strategic backdrop and building a mental map for you.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, we throw around the word Himalayas, but the reality of the Western sector is, well, it's something else entirely.
Oh, absolutely. You really need to picture a 300-kilometer frontage. It stretches all the way from Dalit Begoldi, which we'll just call DBO, and the Karakoram Pass in the freezing north, down past the Galwan Valley, the Cheng Shenmo River, this massive lake called Pangongso, then Chushul, and all the way down to Demchok in the south.
Okay, 300 kilometers. To put that into perspective, that's roughly the distance from New York City to Boston. But it's not a paved highway corridor.
No, not at all. It's a jagged, frozen, vertical wasteland. The average altitude of the valley floors alone is around 14,000 feet.
Wow.
Yeah, and the actual military posts we're going to talk about, they were perched much, much higher than that.
Yeah, the sources mention Post Bishen sitting at 18,645 feet, which is just insane. I mean, base camp at Mount Everest is about 17,500 feet.
Yeah.
Climbers spend weeks just acclimatizing to survive there in, high-tech down suits.
Right. And these soldiers in 1962 were expected to live, patrol, dig trenches in solid permafrost, and actively fight at altitudes where the human body is literally dying from oxygen starvation.
So every step is just exhausting.
Exactly. At 18,000 feet, the air pressure is roughly half of what it is at sea level. Digging a defensive trench into that ice and rock takes 10 times longer. Your rifles jam because the lubricants just freeze solid.
Oh, I hadn't even thought about the weapons freezing.
Oh, yeah. And artillery shells actually behave differently in thin air. But the biggest issue, the absolute biggest, is that carrying supplies up to these isolated posts becomes this impossible Herculean task.
Which perfectly brings us to the strategic backdrop that set this whole tragedy in motion, the forward policy.
Right. So by late 1959, the Chinese had already occupied a large portion of the Aksai Chin Plateau. And in response to this, the Indian government initiated the forward policy.
Okay, what was the actual stated aim of that policy?
Well, the goal was to firmly hold areas not yet occupied by the Chinese. Basically, to prevent further infiltration and to push forward up to the Indian claim line. They wanted to hit places like Murgo, Saksalu, Phobrang Chushul, and Demchok.
Wait, hold on. Let's really look at the mechanics of this. They're basically taking small groups of soldiers, like a dozen guys here, maybe 30 guys there, and just dropping them onto freezing peaks to act as markers.
Yeah, pretty much.
Like literal flags on a map. If you only have a few dozen men and they're completely isolated from each other, how is that supposed to stop an advancing army?
Well, see, that's the catch. It wasn't designed to stop an army. The forward policy was driven almost entirely by a political calculation, not a military one.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it was based on this deeply flawed strategic equation. In geopolitics, there's a concept we can look at as the formula for effective control. Claim plus presence plus capability equals effective control.
Okay, so let me break that down. India had the claim. And they established the physical presence by literally putting these small pockets of troops on the ground. But they completely lacked the capability part of the equation.
Precisely. They lacked the capability to sustain those troops or supply them or reinforce them or even provide covering artillery fire. They essentially put the cart miles ahead of the horse.
So they just assumed the Chinese would back off.
Exactly. The assumption in New Delhi was that simply establishing these posts would deter the Chinese without provoking a massive, violent reaction. I mean, they were playing a high-altitude game of chess, assuming the other side wouldn't just, violently kick over the board.
But the military commanders actually, on the ground, had to know this was a disaster waiting to happen, right? Because the sources detail a very stark warning from the general officer commanding-in-chief of the Western Command.
Oh, he was incredibly explicit about it. He formally warned the government that pushing these isolated forward posts into Chinese-held areas, especially anywhere near the Aksai-Chin Road, was going to trigger a violent response.
Yeah, he literally stated that political direction needs to be based on military means.
Yes. And crucially, he explicitly stated that to properly implement this policy, the forces in Ladakh needed to be built up to at least a divisional strength.
Okay, let's translate that for the listener for a second. A division is huge. We're talking roughly, 10,000 to 15,000 soldiers? Complete with dedicated artillery regiments, massive supply trains, medical units, engineering battalions.
Exactly. It's a massive self-sustaining army.
But what did India actually have in place to cover this 300-kilometer front?
A tiny fraction of that. The defense of this entire massive frontage fell to just the 114 Infantry Brigade, which was headquartered at Leh, under the command of Brigadier T.N. Rana.
And a brigade is much smaller than a division.
Much smaller. Initially, they only had 2 regular infantry battalions, the 18 Gorkha Rifles and the 5 JAT plus some local Jammu and Kashmir militia units.
Wait, 2 battalions? A battalion is only about 800 men, right?
Roughly, yeah.
So you're asking maybe 2,000 regular troops and some lightly armed local militia to guard a frozen expanse the size of the New York to Boston corridor. That's not a defense line, that's a tripwire. Why couldn't they push more troops up there?
Again, it comes back to geography and logistics. The document notes that because of the brutal terrain, it took over a year and a half just to induct one single infantry battalion into Ladakh.
A year and a half for one battalion?
Yeah. There were no roads capable of handling heavy military convoys. Everything, every bullet, every ration tin had to be carried on the backs of mules or by the soldiers themselves over these treacherous mountain passes that were closed by snow for half the year.
Okay, so if India could only push one battalion up those mountains in 18 months, it begs the question, what was China doing during that exact same window?
Well, the answer to that is honestly terrifying. They weren't just walking, they were paving. While India was struggling with mules, China was building Highway 215.
A highway?
Yep.
Across the Aksai-Chin Plateau, at an elevation of 14,000 to 17,000 feet. I mean, the engineering required to build a road on permafrost is just mind-boggling. You can't just lay asphalt. The ground freezes and thaws, literally ripping the roads apart.
Right, and the internal combustion engines of their construction equipment would be constantly choking for oxygen. The human and logistical cost of building that road must have been staggering.
But they did it.
They did. It was a monumental feat, completed in September 1957, and it formally connected the regions of Xinjiang and Tibet. Strategically, a road changes the entire mathematical equation of warfare.
Because it replaces the mule with the heavy truck.
Exactly. By August 1962, the Chinese had used this logistical artery to quietly build up to a full infantry division in the area, backed by really solid operational and administrative support.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. They didn't just have the numbers. They organized the battle space perfectly. The source mentions the Xinjiang Military Command set up a forward headquarters at a place called Kangshiwar.
Right, positioned south of the Kunlun Mountains. And from there, they systematically divided the area into 4 distinct, mutually supporting defense areas running from north to south.
Those were the Tianwendian Defense Area, the Huaitan Defense Area, the Kongka Pass Defense Area, and the Ali Defense Area.
Yes. And their forces included the 2nd Infantry Regiment, the Ali Detachment, plus 2 battalions and a cavalry regiment drawn from the 4th Infantry Division.
And the text points out something crucial about that 4th Infantry Division. It notes they were recycled and rested.
Right. That is the ultimate luxury in modern warfare, having a strategic reserve. Because the Chinese had roads, they could literally truck soldiers up to the front lines, let them fight, and then truck them back to a rear area to sleep, get a hot meal, and recover from the altitude.
While the Indian troops were just stuck on those isolated peaks for months on end, freezing, exhausted, and probably slowly starving.
Exactly. It was an absolute mismatch. Which brings us to the morning of October 20th, 1962, when the opening attacks begin.
So what was the Chinese objective that morning?
It was brutal and incredibly simple. Eliminate all 43 Indian forward posts across the 1960 claim line. They prioritized the two northernmost areas first, the Tianwendian Defense Area, which faced the Indian DBO sector, and the Huaitan Defense Area, facing the Galwan River Valley.
And before a single shot was fired, they had already won the math game. The text says the Chinese built up a numerical superiority of 10-1 in infantry and a 7-1 superiority in artillery firepower. Plus, they maneuvered to block all the Indian routes of withdrawal.
Right, so let's apply our six-step framework to the Dalat Beg Oldi, or DBO, sector to see how this played out.
Okay, let's do it.
Step 1, strategic objective. The Chinese wanted to secure their northernmost claim line. Step 2, terrain challenge. We are talking extreme altitude, specifically places like point 5270.
Which brings us to step 3, deployment decision. And this is where the disparity is just shocking. India deployed the 14 J&K militia here. At point 5270, there were just 62 Indian troops.
Which is basically an understrength company. And step 4, enemy response. The Chinese hit them with an intense 30-minute artillery bombardment at first light on October 20th.
I really want you, the listener, to try and imagine the physics of an artillery barrage at that altitude. At sea level, a heavy artillery shell hits the dirt and creates a crater, which absorbs some of the explosive force. But on a Himalayan peak, the ground is solid rock and permafrost.
Yeah, so when a shell detonates there, the rock itself shatters, right? It creates thousands of secondary projectiles, stone shrapnel.
Exactly. Unless you have deep, reinforced concrete bunkers, which India absolutely did not have, a 30-minute barrage of that magnitude is just apocalyptic.
But despite that, we get to step 5, battle outcome. The 14 J&K militia somehow holds out all day against roughly 500 Chinese troops.
The casualties were horrific, though. At point 5270 alone, 42 Indian soldiers were killed, and 20 were wounded or captured. At another nearby post, the text notes only one single man survived.
Yeah, it was a massacre. But the individual heroism is undeniable. The document records several decorations for gallantry here. Subedar Sanam was awarded the Mahavir Chakra, which is India's second highest military honor. And Sepoys Chiring, Wangchuck, and Funchak received Veer Chakras.
Which is incredible bravery. But that brings us to step 6, lessons learned. Because strategically, what does this tell us?
It tells us that heroism simply cannot overcome a 10-1 concentration of force, especially when you have zero defensive depth.
Right, if you're trapped on a mountain without reinforcements and you don't have your own artillery to fire back, the enemy can literally just take their time and dismantle you.
Exactly. A forward post is meant to observe and delay the enemy while falling back onto a main defensive line. But because of the flawed forward policy, these posts were the line. There was nothing behind them.
Which is a fatal flaw that's perfectly illustrated in our next case study, the Galwan River Valley. Honestly, reading about Galwan is just agonizing.
It really is. Now, the Chinese viewed the Indian post in the Galwan Valley as the most dangerous position in their Huaitan defense area.
Why were they so fixated on this one specific valley?
Because of where the Indians managed to place it. The Galwan post was situated in a way that physically cut off the rearward communication and supply lines of 3 Chinese outposts. It was this massive strategic thorn. They couldn't just ignore it. They had to carve it out.
Okay, so let's run the framework here. Deployment decision. The Indian troops there were from the 5 JAT Regiment. Subedar Jung's platoon had been holding the valley since July, and they were eventually reinforced by a company led by Major Hassabnis. Total strength, 68 troops.
Just 68 guys to hold a valley against an entire Chinese regiment. And because they were trying to show a flag across this wide area, those 68 men weren't even kept together in one defensible fortress.
Right, they were broken up into these tiny micro-posts, like Post Parmadak, elevation 17,000 feet. The text says it was held by 1 non-commissioned officer and 5 other ranks.
6 men.
6 men. Can you imagine the psychological toll of that? You're 6 guys sitting on top of the world? Your radios probably barely work? Your supply line is just a guy with a mule who shows up maybe once a week.
Yeah.
And you look across the valley and see hundreds of Chinese troops building roads, bringing up heavy mortars, just waiting for the order to wipe you out.
And when that order finally came, The destruction was horribly methodical. The text highlights Havildar Tulsi Ram at Post Parmadak. After his 5 squad mates were killed, he stood completely alone, firing his light machine gun at the advancing Chinese infantry.
And let's talk about the LMG for a second. A light machine gun is usually the anchor of a small squad's defense. It fires rapidly, and it's meant to suppress the enemy so your guys can maneuver, but it eats ammunition incredibly fast.
Right.
So Tulsi Ram is firing his LMG until he is completely overrun and gunned down. He didn't have a supply line to bring him more bullets. He just had whatever was in the magazines right next to him.
And we see the exact same thing happen at Post Bashan, which was even higher up, at 18,645 feet.
Oh, right. The one with Company Havildar Major Anand Ram.
Yes. He and 12 men of the J&K militia survived 45 minutes of heavy artillery pounding. And miraculously, they beat back 2 infantry assaults before finding a gap along a steep precipice and escaping.
But the overall battle outcome for Galwan was total defeat. By October 24th, the Chinese swept the entire valley clean. They eliminated all 6 Indian posts in just 72 hours.
Yeah, 5 JAT suffered heavy casualties. And the military lesson learned here is foundational. A forward post must be tactically sustainable.
The text actually explicitly notes that some of these Indian posts had to be abandoned and withdrawn from without even a fight, because they were fundamentally impossible to supply or defend.
Right. If a post cannot be supplied with food and ammunition and it cannot be supported by artillery from the rear, it's not a military asset, it's just an administrative liability.
Which the Chinese exploited flawlessly.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving chronologically and geographically, this brings us down to the massive, high-altitude Lake Pangong-so. The battles there took place from October 21st to the 23rd.
Now, Pangong-so is a very unique geographical feature. It's this incredibly long, narrow lake winding right through the mountains. And here, the Chinese faced a slightly different strategic puzzle.
How so?
Well, the text notes that unlike the overwhelming 10-to-1 odds they had in the north, the Chinese only had a, quote, slender margin of superiority in terms of attacking troops around the lake.
So they couldn't just throw endless bodies at the problem. They had to adapt.
Exactly. So they created an ad hoc task force. The text says they scraped together 117 personnel drawn from various detachments specifically to hit the Indian posts on the northern bank of the lake.
Okay, the northern bank. Those posts were known as Sirajap III and Sirajap II, right? Manned by a company, less a platoon, of the 18 Gorkha rifles. So again, roughly 70 or 80 men.
Yes. And the text explicitly states these 2 Sirajap positions were not mutually supporting.
Okay, let's unpack that. What does not mutually supporting actually mean on the ground in a combat scenario?
Well, mutual support is a core tenet of defense. It basically means that if Post A is attacked, Post B is close enough and has a clear line of sight to fire their machine guns or mortars at the people attacking Post A.
Right, they cover each other's backs.
Exactly. But if posts are not mutually supporting, it means there's a ridge or a mountain or just way too much distance between them. The enemy can completely surround Post A, destroy it, and the guys at Post B can only listen to the gunfire, totally powerless to help.
Which is exactly what happened at Pangong-so. The Chinese task force isolated Sirajap I. The attack began at Loro 600 hours with an intense artillery pounding. The Gorkhas, who were led by Major Dan Singh Kappa, were completely cut off.
Now, the Gorkha regiments are historically legendary for their ferocity, especially in close-quarters combat. And despite the heavy artillery fire absolutely destroying their shallow bunkers, they managed to beat back the first 2 Chinese assaults.
But, like we said earlier, the math always catches up. The third assault comes in. The Gorkhas are basically out of ammunition. Their positions are reduced to smoking craters. And the text describes this incredibly cinematic, horrifying final stand.
Yeah, it's harrowing.
The surviving Gorkhas leap out of their trenches, shouting their war cry, Ayo Gorkhali, which translates to, the Gorkhas are upon you. And they engage in a brutal hand-to-hand fight, using bayonets and their traditional curved knives, the kukris.
By 830 hours, it was over. The post was wiped out. But their resistance was so fierce that they inflicted around 100 casualties on that Chinese task force.
Wow, over 80% casualty rate for the attackers.
Yeah. Major Dan Singh Thapa survived, though he was taken prisoner, and he was later awarded the Paramvir Chakra, which is India's absolute highest military decoration for valor.
Just a breathtaking display of combat motivation and leadership. But strategically, the Sirajap complex fell on October 21st. Now, while this absolute massacre is happening on the northern bank, what is going on with the Indian troops on the southern bank of the lake?
On the southern bank, the 18 Gorkha rifles had established 3 posts called the Eula Complex. Eula 1, 2, and 3. They got about a company's worth of men stationed there.
And this is where the forward policy just looks like sheer madness to me. The Chinese considered these EULA posts to be 20 kilometers inside their claim line.
Right.
20 kilometers. These troops are dangling completely alone, deep in hostile territory.
And imagine the psychological nightmare they were going through. The text notes that these Indian troops on the south bank physically watched the artillery barrage and the destruction of Sirjaptas and Second across the lake.
Oh man, they saw their comrades annihilated.
Yes, they knew they were next. They were isolated. The Chinese held the higher ground, dominating their positions, and their only route of withdrawal was already compromised.
So what happened? Did they fight to the death too?
No, the command finally makes a rational decision. Realizing it's a completely hopeless position, the Indian troops are ordered to withdraw during the night to a high ground north of Gurung Hill.
But even that goes wrong, doesn't it? The text says they were intercepted during the nighttime withdrawal. They get sucked into a running firefight and suffer heavy casualties just trying to retreat.
Right. So the overarching lesson learned from Pangongso really reinforces the failure of the forward policy's design. If your outposts cannot support each other, and the forces on the north and south banks of a major geographic barrier, like a massive lake, are completely disconnected, you just don't have a cohesive front.
Right. The enemy will simply dismantle your positions piecemeal, one by one.
Exactly.
Now, once the Chinese secured the lake in all the northern sectors, you would think they'd pause, right? Consolidate their gains, take a breath. But they didn't. They immediately pivoted.
Right. Between October 26th and 28th, they shift their entire focus south, towards the Indus Valley and Chushul.
And this pivot highlights a really stark contrast in operational mobility.
Yeah.
Why did they go south?
Well, the Indus River Valley is flanked by low hills with passes leading directly onto the Tibetan Plateau. The Chinese command analyzed the map and realized that Indian forces could potentially use this valley as an approach route to threaten their southern flank. So they proactively decided to eliminate that threat.
So on October 22nd, the Xinjiang Military Command issues new orders. They take the troops of the 4th Infantry Division, the exact same division that just wiped out the northern posts, and order them to move south to a place called Ritazong.
Yes.
And this is the detail that completely stopped me in my tracks when I read the document. The troops had to move about 500 kilometers over rough, frozen tracks.
You really have to think about the logistical footprint of moving an entire infantry division 500 kilometers. You need hundreds of transport trucks. You need fuel trucks just to keep the transport trucks running. You need massive amounts of food, winter gear, medical supplies, and mobile artillery.
Right.
Doing this in the Himalayas in late October is an astonishing feat of military logistics, and they did it in 3 days and 2 nights of continuous movement.
Okay, hold on. I have a major problem with this from a tactical standpoint. How on earth do you move a massive, miles-long convoy of military trucks 500 kilometers across barren, open terrain in broad daylight?
Wow!
Because in modern warfare, a convoy like that is a sitting duck for air power. One squadron of bombers would turn that 500-kilometer convoy into a highway of death.
That is the exact tactical vulnerability the Chinese exposed themselves to, but they took the gamble because they knew something crucial. The text provides the grim answer, and I'll quote it. As India had decided not to use the IAF, the PLA was able to move over open and barren terrain of Ladakh, even during day, with impunity.
India made a conscious policy decision to restrict the Indian Air Force to transport and supply drops only. They literally refused to use their fighter jets or bombers for offensive combat operations.
Right.
Now, we aren't going to get into the complex political fears of escalation that drove that decision in New Delhi, but strictly on a tactical level. Giving the enemy uncontested movement in an environment without tree cover is a fatal error.
It's a massive error. The Chinese basically marched an entire division down an open road without a single bomb dropping on them.
Unbelievable.
Okay.
So with that unhindered mobility, the Chinese executed a textbook tactical maneuver in the Indus Valley, a two-pronged pincer movement. Let's break that down.
Sure. So they split their force. One battalion group advanced on the northern flank. Their goal was to swing around behind the Indian positions and cut off their only route of withdrawal.
And the second group?
The second, heavier group advanced on the southern flank along the Sichuan River Valley. The objective of a pincer movement is encirclement. They wanted to trap the Indian forces, specifically the 7 J&K militia, stationed between Zamagere and Karigwo, and annihilate them completely in a pocket.
So they launched the main attack on the night of October 27th. But the pincer doesn't fully close, does it?
No, fortunately for the Indian militia troops, it didn't. The southern outflanking move by the heavier Chinese force was delayed. Moving that heavy equipment through the terrain finally slowed them down just enough.
So the trap didn't snap shut in time.
Exactly. Because of that delay, the 7 J&K militia troops were able to execute a fighting withdrawal during the night of October 27th to the 28th.
They made it out, which is great, but strategically the ground was still lost. By the end of October, the Chinese had achieved their objectives in the south, occupying the dominating Kailash range along the eastern bank of the Indus River.
Which brings us to a really critical phase of the campaign. After a week of intense, largely one-sided combat, the front line stabilized. There was a lull in the fighting from October 29th all the way to November 17th.
This lull is fascinating because it's where we see the Indian military desperately trying to learn and adapt while the clock is ticking, the reorganization phase. They finally realized that trying to command a 300-kilometer front with a single brigade headquarters is just geographically impossible.
Oh, the reorganization was frantic. Headquarters 114 Brigade was pushed forward from Leh directly into the crucial defensive hub of Chushul. And to take the pressure off them, a brand new headquarters, the 17th Infantry Brigade, was inducted specifically to handle the Indus Valley subsector.
And then, the big one. On October 26th, they finally raised the 3 Himalayan Division in Leh, placing it under the command of Major General Bosing.
Right. Remember the unheeded warning from the Western Command General before the war even started? The one who begged the government for a divisional strength force before implementing the forward policy?
Yeah.
Well, now, with the Chinese already sitting on the commanding heights looking down at them, the Indian Army is desperately trying to cobble that exact division together.
It's a race against time and gravity.
Yeah.
Because, you can declare a new division on paper, but you still have to physically move heavy equipment up into the mountains without a highway system.
Exactly.
And this is where we see one of the most unbelievable feats of the entire conflict. If you don't have roads and your ground logistics are failing, the sky's your only option.
Yes. The document details a massive, desperate aviation feat. The Indian Air Force used these massive AN-12 transport aircraft from their 44th Squadron to physically airlift AMX-13 light tanks directly into Chushul on October 24th and 25th.
Let's really dissect the engineering nightmare of what you just described. The AMX-13 is a French-designed light tank. It weighs roughly 14 tons.
Right.
And the AN-12 is a Soviet-built 4-engine turboprop transport plane. You're loading a 14-ton piece of armor into a cargo plane.
Which, to be fair, is standard procedure at sea level, but not in the Himalayas.
Exactly. The airstrip at Chushul is just a dirt runway sitting at over 14,000 feet.
Mm-hmm.
At that altitude, the air is incredibly thin. An aircraft wing needs dense air flowing over it to generate lift.
Yeah, the physics are totally against it.
Right, so in thin air, the plane has to fly much, much faster just to stay airborne. This means the stalling speed is higher, and the landing approach speed has to be insanely fast.
And you are landing a massive aircraft carrying a 14-ton metal box at high speed onto an unpaved dirt strip that is surrounded by towering mountain peaks dealing with unpredictable Himalayan crosswinds.
The stress on the landing gear alone, if a tire blows or a strut snaps, that plane is a fireball. And yet, the pilots of 44 Squadron did it. And they didn't just drop off one tank. They airlifted an entire troop of tanks from the 20 Lancers.
They also flew in a field artillery regiment and a heavy mortar battery.
It's just wild.
It really is. And this action perfectly encapsulates a vital lesson in high-altitude warfare. Air transport can act as a massive force multiplier. It fundamentally alters your defensive depth.
Right. When your ground infrastructure is lacking, when you don't have a Highway 215, strategic airlifts are the only way to rapidly concentrate force and firepower at a critical choke point like Chushul. It was an incredible display of skill by the IAF pilots, and it undeniably bolstered the defenses at Chushul and showed that the Indian military could adapt under fire.
True, but it doesn't erase the fundamental strategic errors that made such desperate measures necessary in the first place.
No, it doesn't. Now, the outlay mentions we should briefly compare this western sector, Ladakh, with the eastern sector, which was NEFA, or the Northeast Frontier Agency.
Yeah, it's a useful comparison. In NEFA, the terrain was heavily forested and featured steep, jungle-covered valleys, unlike the barren, high-altitude desert of Ladakh.
But did the logistical problems remain the same?
Oh, absolutely. In both sectors, India suffered from a lack of roads, poor communication, and inadequate defense preparation. The Chinese, conversely, utilized their superior logistics and unified command to overrun the Indian positions in both theaters. The geography was different, but the math, the force concentration, and the supply chain dominance was exactly the same.
Which brings us to the answer writing framework section for our listeners, because we've covered a ton of ground and we want to make sure you retain this. So if you were sitting for an advanced military history exam right now, how would you structure your answer on the Western sector operations?
I would break it down into a 5-point framework. First, the background. Explain the forward policy's intent versus its reality. The claim plus presence minus capability issue.
Second point.
Second, the Chinese success factors. You have to mention Highway 215, the unified command at Kangshiwar, and their massive 10-to-1 concentration of force.
Got it. And the third point.
Third is the operational analysis of Galwan and Pangongso. Highlight the fatal flaw of isolated, tactically unsustainable microposts that completely lacked mutual support.
Right. Fourth point. Logistics. Contrast the 500-kilometer PLA movement with India's desperate AN-12 tank airlifts.
Exactly. And finally, the fifth point is the conclusion, answering our central question. Occupying territory requires a logistical backbone, not just a flag in the ground.
Awesome. Let's do a quick rapid-fire flashcard review to cement these facts for the listener. I'll throw out the prompt, you give the answer.
Ready? Ready. Let's do it.
Date of the opening Chinese attacks.
October 20th, 1962.
Length of the Western sector frontage.
300 kilometers.
Key Indian commander initially in charge of the sector.
Brigadier Tien Reyna, commanding the 114 Brigade.
The Paramvir Chakra recipient we discussed.
Major Don Singh Thapa, for his last stand at Sirajap on Pangongso.
Highest Indian post mentioned in the text.
Post Bishan, at a staggering 18,645 feet.
And finally, the Chinese advantage at the start of the conflict.
10-to-1 in troops and 7-to-1 in artillery.
Perfect. So this brings us back to the central question we posed at the very beginning of this analysis. Why does occupying territory require a complete operational system and not only forward presence?
Because 1962 proved, with devastating clarity, that presence without capability is an illusion. The forward policy assumed that placing a handful of brave men with bolt-action rifles on a freezing peak somehow projected state power. It didn't.
State power, in a military context, is measured in logistics.
Exactly. The Chinese succeeded not because their soldiers were inherently braver, but because behind their frontline troops was a unified command structure at Kangshiwar. Behind that command was Highway 215.
And behind that highway was a logistical system capable of rotating troops, rushing up artillery shells, and moving an entire infantry division 500 kilometers in 3 days.
Right. And the Indian forces, despite individual acts of unimaginable heroism like Major Thapa's Kukri charge or Havildar Tulsi Ram standing alone with his LMG, they were systematically crushed because they were denied mutual support.
They were placed in tactically unsustainable microposts, cut off from resupply, and basically ordered to hold territory without the operational system required to actually do it.
We often study military history by focusing on the weapons, the tactics and the valor, but the ultimate underlying lesson of the Western sector in 1962 is that logistics dictate the limits of strategy.
Yeah.
You can draw a line on a map. You can order a soldier to stand on that line, but if you cannot build a road to that soldier, you have already lost the mountain.
Wow. Think about how we view borders today. We often look at lines on a map and assume that placing a soldier on that line means the territory is secured. But 1962 teaches us a brutal truth. A forward presence without a road behind it isn't a defense. It's a vulnerability. The true measure of territorial control isn't where your bravest soldier stands, but how far your supply chain can reach. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the raw mechanics of high-altitude warfare. Keep questioning the lines on the maps, always look for the supply routes, and we'll get you next time.